In the Boston suburbs, where autumn evenings came early, Margaret Connor was pushing her grandfather William's wheelchair down a quiet residential street. William's white hair gleamed silver in the setting sun, and his deeply lined face still held the dignity of a soldier who had fought through the Korean War. "Going to the library again, Margaret?" William looked up at his granddaughter with a smile. "Yes, Grandpa. They got some new books in." "War memoirs?" Margaret placed her hand on William's shoulder. Her voice was gentle, and from her years of experience as a librarian, she had developed a way of speaking that brought comfort to people. When they returned home, the sound of the television echoed loudly in the living room. Patricia, her mother, sat on the sofa with the composed posture befitting a former teacher, while her retired father Robert was reading the newspaper. They seemed to maintain the quiet harmony cultivated through years of marriage. "Welcome home. Stephanie is bringing the children over today," Patricia said to Margaret. Her voice carried complicated emotions toward her daughters. There was love, but she couldn't hide her disappointment in Margaret, who at 35 was still single and living at home. "I see," Margaret replied as she helped William settle into his favorite chair in the living room. Her sister's monthly visits had become routine, but they were also an uncomfortable time for Margaret. An hour later, the doorbell rang and bright voices filled the house. Stephanie appeared with her two sons, ages 7 and 5. Thanks to her husband's medical career, she lived comfortably, and that confidence showed in every aspect of her behavior. She wore a designer coat with perfectly styled hair and tasteful makeup that declared her special status within the family. "How are you feeling, Grandpa?" Stephanie asked, kissing William's cheek. "I'm doing well. Margaret takes such good care of me," William replied, looking between his granddaughters. "Is that so?" "Thank you so much." Stephanie smiled lightly at Margaret, but there was something condescending in her gaze. While preparing dinner, Margaret listened to the family conversation from the kitchen. Stephanie was talking about the children's school, her husband's promotion at the hospital, and the renovation of their newly purchased home. Patricia and Robert listened intently, as if hearing about celebrities. "Is Margaret still working at the library?" Stephanie's question reached her ears. "Yes, it's been more than 10 years now," Patricia answered. "It's stable, but I wish she had a bit more ambition. Margaret has such a gentle nature, maybe that's fine for her." Stephanie's words carried subtle superiority. As Margaret washed dishes, she realized she had grown accustomed to these conversations. To her family, she was a convenient caretaker for William and a shadow that highlighted Stephanie's success. She took pride in her library work and was often appreciated by community members, but within her family, she was always treated as second-rate. That night, as she helped her grandfather to bed, William took his granddaughter's hand. "Margaret, thank you for everything. You're such a kind girl." "Grandpa, it's only natural. We're family." Margaret gently squeezed her grandfather's hand in return. However, William had been falling ill more frequently lately. The doctor had said anything could happen at any time, and Margaret lived with constant anxiety. Still, she was the only one in the family seriously considering grandfather's care. 3 days later in the morning, Margaret discovered William's cold body in his room. He had passed away quietly in the night, his face as peaceful as if in deep sleep. With trembling hands, she called an ambulance and then contacted the family. "Grandpa passed away," Margaret told her mother over the phone. "Oh, finally," Patricia's voice held more relief at a long-anticipated event than surprise. "I'll come home right away. Call Stephanie too." An hour later, when the family gathered in the living room, an air of formal grief filled the space. Patricia had appropriate tears in her eyes, and Robert wore a serious expression, but somehow it all seemed like acting. Poor Grandpa. At least he didn't suffer at the end. Stephanie had arrived with David, having left the children at their own home. Her physician husband wore a black suit, displaying appropriate mourning. "Margaret, what about the funeral arrangements?" Patricia asked. "I've already contacted the funeral home. We have a meeting tomorrow afternoon," Margaret replied, consulting her planner. Having been the one to witness grandfather's final moments, she naturally took on the funeral preparations. "Wonderful. You're so dependable, Stephanie patted her sister's shoulder lightly. We're busy, so we can leave it all to you, right? Margaret nodded silently. It was always this way. All the troublesome work came to her. That evening, the family discussed the inheritance. Robert was sorting through grandfather's papers, investigating bank balances and property values. Father had quite a bit of assets, Patricia said with surprise. Combining his pension, military benefits, and the house value, it adds up to quite a substantial amount. Is there a will? Stephanie asked with interest. We haven't found one yet, but normally it would be divided among children and grandchildren, Robert answered. Since I have 2 children, considering the future, it would be nice if I could receive a bit more, Stephanie said hesitantly but confidently. Education costs are expensive, and David's hospital is considering expansion. That's only natural, Patricia agreed. Margaret is single and doesn't need as much money. Margaret listened silently. Her family was already discussing inheritance before even a day had passed since grandfather's death, and she felt deep sadness. The next day, relatives began arriving one after another. Aunt Carol, Patricia's sister, and her husband, Robert's brother's family, and cousins from far away gathered at the house. Margaret, still single? Aunt Carol asked with a sympathetic expression. Yes, Margaret replied briefly. You need to be more assertive, Aunt Carol shook her head. Look at Stephanie. A wonderful husband and adorable children. You should follow her example. Similar questions from relatives continued. Still living at home? When are you getting married? When will you have children? Margaret answered politely, though she was exhausted inside. That evening, Margaret was organizing grandfather's room. Old military uniforms, medals, and numerous photographs were packed in boxes. When she opened the drawer of grandfather's bedside table, she found an envelope. The envelope was handwritten by grandfather, to Margaret. She took the envelope and stared at it for a while. She wanted to check the contents, but it didn't feel like the right time yet. Margaret, what are you doing? Stephanie entered the room. I'm organizing Grandpa's belongings, Margaret slipped the envelope into her pocket. That must be hard. Did you find anything valuable? Stephanie looked around the room. Not particularly. Just mementos. I see. Well, the really valuable things are probably in the bank safety deposit box, Stephanie said, losing interest. Are tomorrow's funeral preparations going smoothly? Yes, everything is arranged. That's such a relief. We have the children to look after, so we can't handle all the details. Stephanie sounded grateful, but it came across as matter of fact. That night, at the family dinner table, final confirmations were made about tomorrow's funeral. Who will give the eulogy? Patricia asked. How about Uncle Robert, and then Stephanie as the grandchildren's representative? Aunt Carol suggested. Me? Stephanie looked surprised. But Margaret spent much more time with him. But you're better at speaking, Patricia said to her daughter. Margaret isn't good at public speaking. Margaret said nothing. Indeed, she was the one who had spent the most time with grandfather and cared for him until the end. But to her family, she was always a supporting character. All right. I'll try my best, Stephanie agreed to take it on. Late that night, Margaret stared at grandfather's envelope in her room. She debated whether to open it but decided to wait until after tomorrow's funeral. Learning what grandfather wanted to convey could wait until after the funeral. The morning of the funeral brought cold autumn rain. People dressed in black quietly gathered in the parking lot of St. Mark's Church. Margaret arrived earlier than her family to confirm final preparations. She arranged grandfather's portrait on the altar, adjusted the flower arrangements, and met with funeral home staff about handling mourners. Margaret, thank you for all your hard work, a female staff member from the funeral home said. Your grandfather was truly loved. From the preparation stage, your feelings came through very clearly. Thank you, Margaret smiled. Grandfather was truly a wonderful person. An hour later, the family arrived. Patricia wore a black suit with a pearl necklace, her makeup appropriately subdued to show mourning. Robert was also dressed in a black suit with a solemn expression. Stephanie appeared with her husband David, wearing designer mourning attire. "Sister, thank you for all the preparation work," Stephanie immediately addressed Margaret upon arrival. "We were busy preparing the eulogy and couldn't handle all the details." "It's fine. Everything is taken care of," Margaret replied. When the funeral began, the church was packed with mourners. Grandfather's military comrades, neighbors, and relatives from far away quietly took their seats. After the pastor's sermon, Robert read the eulogy. "William Hart, my father-in-law, was an irreplaceable presence for our family. After serving our country as a soldier, he continued to cherish his family and always watched over us." Next, Stephanie came forward as the grandchildren's representative. "Grandfather William was a precious presence who taught us grandchildren about strength and kindness. I want to pass on what I learned from him to my own children." Margaret listened quietly from her seat. She had cared for grandfather every day for 2 years and stayed by his side until his final moment, but this wasn't mentioned in the eulogies. After the funeral, attendees gathered in the meeting room adjacent to the church for light refreshments while remembering the deceased. Margaret moved busily around, busy responding to attendees. "That girl really works hard," one distant relative murmured. "But she's 35 and single, right?" "That's a bit worrying," another relative replied. About an hour later, Margaret headed to a small anteroom next to the meeting room to change out of her morning dress. Just as she reached for the door handle, she heard relatives' voices from inside. "That girl is still living at home, right?" It was Aunt Carol's voice. Margaret stopped her hand. She hesitated about whether to open the door, but the conversation inside concerned her. "Yes, she's the shame of our family," her mother Patricia's voice continued. 35 years old and no redeeming qualities. No marriage prospects, and a librarian's salary is nothing special. Poor thing. But since Stephanie turned out so wonderfully, maybe it balances out, Aunt Carol said. "Stephanie is truly our pride," Patricia's voice brightened. "As a doctor's wife, she's raising her children splendidly. Today's eulogy was wonderful too, wasn't it?" "Yes. Compared to that, Margaret is." "Grandfather didn't expect much from sister either," Stephanie's voice suddenly interrupted. "Unlike someone like me who showed him great-grandchildren. Grandpa doted on my children much more." Margaret gasped. The hand holding her morning dress was trembling. "Well, but Margaret did handle the caregiving, so that was helpful," Patricia added. "We were busy." "That's right. I'm grateful to Margaret. But that's about her only redeeming quality," Stephanie's voice contained a faint mockery. "Can't get married, no career, she has to at least be useful to the family." About the inheritance, Aunt Carol lowered her voice. "It would be nice if Stephanie could get more. Education costs are expensive." "Of course," Patricia agreed. "Margaret is alone, has her library pension, and doesn't need that much money." Margaret quietly left the area. She walked past the anteroom, down the hallway, and outside the church. Finding her car in the parking lot, she sat in the driver's seat. The rain was still falling. The sound of raindrops hitting the windshield seemed to ease the pain in her heart. She had sensed how her family felt about her, but she never expected to hear it stated so clearly. For 2 years, she had cared for grandfather every day. She woke up early to prepare his medicine, took care of his meals, drove him to hospital appointments, and stayed by his side until he fell asleep each night. Weekends, holidays, she dedicated all her personal time to grandfather. Yet to her family, this was just the natural work of someone whose only redeeming quality was this. Margaret took grandfather's envelope from her handbag. She had kept the envelope marked to Margaret, unopened until now. But she felt this was the moment. Opening the envelope, she found a lawyer's business card and grandfather's letter inside. "To my beloved Margaret. If you are reading this letter, it means I am no longer in this world. You alone loved me as true family until the end. You alone treated me not as a source of money or an object of care, but as a human being. The other family members were interested in my assets but not in me as a person. I want to entrust everything to you. Contact Harrison Law Office. The will has already been prepared. You are the true heir of our family. With love, Grandpa. After reading the letter, Margaret sat stunned for a while. She hadn't realized grandfather understood her feelings so deeply. And that there was a will. Looking at the lawyer's business card, she saw the address and phone number. She should contact them tomorrow. There was a tap on the car window. David was peering in with concern. Margaret, are you all right? Everyone is looking for you. Thank you, I'll be right back. Margaret put the letter and business card in her handbag and got out of the car. When she returned to the meeting room, the family hadn't noticed her absence. They were still busy greeting attendees. Margaret, where were you? Patricia turned around. Just getting some fresh air outside, Margaret replied quietly. After that, Margaret mechanically continued responding to attendees. But in her heart, grandfather's words kept echoing, you alone were true family. That evening, after all the attendees had left, only the family remained. Despite their exhausted expressions, there was a sense of relief. Thank you for your hard work, Stephanie said to Margaret. It was truly a perfect funeral. Yes, we're grateful to Margaret, Patricia agreed. Margaret smiled and replied, I hope Grandpa would be pleased. 3 days after the funeral, on Thursday afternoon, Margaret visited Harrison Law Office. Located on the 3rd floor of an old building in downtown Boston, the office was enveloped in a dignified atmosphere that spoke of history. I'm Margaret Connor, with an appointment to see Mr. Harrison, she told the receptionist, and was immediately shown to an inner office. Ms. Connor, please accept my condolences. A distinguished gentleman in his 60s stood up to greet her. I had a long relationship with William Hart. He was a wonderful man. Thank you, Margaret replied as she sat down. I learned about the will from grandfather's letter. Yes. Actually, Mr. Hart created his will a year ago. And regarding the execution of the will, we need to gather all family members first. Lawyer Harrison took out a thick file. We'll conduct the reading next Monday at 2 p.m. here. Will that work for you? That's fine. I'll inform the family. Also, the lawyer lowered his voice. There's something Mr. Hart left in my care. He took a small video camera from the safe. This is a video message left with the will. It will be played after the will reading. Margaret felt something stir deep in her chest. She couldn't imagine what grandfather was trying to convey at the end. That night, Margaret informed the family about the will reading. Next Monday? Patricia exclaimed in surprise. That's sudden. Well, it's only natural, Stephanie said with interest. Grandpa kept things properly organized. I wonder how much inheritance there is. Robert showed practical interest. The house and savings, plus what's left of the military pension. Probably it'll be divided into thirds or something, Stephanie speculated. But since I have children, it would be nice if I could get a bit more. Margaret listened silently, remembering the contents of grandfather's letter. The true meaning of, I want to entrust everything to you, would soon be revealed. Monday afternoon, the family gathered in the conference room of Harrison Law Office. Patricia and Robert, Stephanie and David, and Margaret sat around a heavy wooden table. Thank you all for gathering despite your busy schedules, Lawyer Harrison began with a solemn expression. Now I will read William Hart's will. He took out official documents from an envelope and adjusted his glasses. I, William Hart, create this will in sound mental condition. The family listened with bated breath. First, regarding my remaining assets after paying all funeral expenses, debts, taxes, etc. My total assets consist of approximately $800,000 in cash deposits, approximately $400,000 in real estate, approximately $300,000 in other securities, totaling approximately $1.5 million. Stephanie's eyes lit up. It was more than she had expected. Regarding the disposition of these total assets, I establish the following. Lawyer Harrison paused. Article 1, 80% of all assets, approximately $1.2 million, shall be inherited by my granddaughter Margaret Connor. Silence fell over the conference room. Patricia and Robert looked at each other, and Stephanie sat frozen with her mouth open. Article 2, the remaining 20%, approximately $300,000, shall be inherited by my son Robert Hart. Wait a minute, Stephanie stood up. This is wrong. Do I get nothing? What about mother? Lawyer Harrison calmly continued. Note that daughter Patricia Connor and granddaughter Stephanie Foster shall inherit only the legal minimum as their statutory share. What's the legal minimum? Stephanie's voice echoed through the room. This is a mistake. This isn't Grandpa's normal judgment. Please be quiet, Lawyer Harrison restrained her. There's still more. I will explain the reasons for this asset distribution. Over the past 2 years, Margaret Connor alone has devotedly provided my care and assistance. Margaret listened with a tightness in her chest. I kept detailed records every day of who visited me and who cared for me. According to those records, out of 730 days, Margaret cared for me for 728 days. Meanwhile, Stephanie Foster's visits were about once a month, totaling 24 times. Patricia Connor visited about once a week, totaling 96 times. But Patricia's face turned pale. We had our own lives. However, most importantly, the lawyer continued, only Margaret respected me as a human being and treated me with affection. Other family members often talked about my assets and future inheritance, but Margaret talked with me about my feelings and memories. Stephanie sat back down, but her face was flushed with anger. But I have children. I need money for their education. This will is legally valid, and in preparation for any objections, I have detailed caregiving records from the past 2 years, physician testimony, and neighbor testimony ready. Lawyer Harrison set down the will. This concludes the will reading. Mr. Hart also left a video message. A video message? Robert asked. The lawyer turned on a television and video player set up in the corner of the room. Grandfather William's image appeared on the screen. This seemed to have been recorded several months ago, and grandfather sat in his wheelchair with a firm expression, looking directly at the camera. To my family, grandfather's voice filled the room. If you are watching this video, you might be surprised or angry about the contents of my will. The grandfather on screen smiled. But this is my final will. Margaret, you loved me until the end. You alone treated me not as a source of money, but as a human being. Stephanie had tears in her eyes, but they were tears of anger rather than sadness. Patricia, Stephanie, it's not that I don't love you. But when you visited me, it was always about inheritance and future money. When I tried to talk about my military days or memories with your grandmother, you showed no interest. Grandfather's voice was quiet but full of conviction. Margaret was different. She listened to my past and tried to understand my current feelings. Not only did she bring my medicine every day, but she looked at old photographs with me and listened to stories from the past. As a soldier, I have valued discipline. I believe in being fair. This inheritance distribution is based on the facts of the past 2 years. Margaret, you are my most precious family. I want you to use this wealth to build your own life. The video ended. Heavy silence filled the conference room. This should be legally contestable, Stephanie pressed the lawyer. His mental state must have been impaired. I'm sorry, Lawyer Harrison replied calmly. Mr. Hart underwent psychiatric evaluation when creating the will and was judged completely normal. Also, as someone who knew him for many years, I can testify that there were no problems with his judgment. But, Patricia said in a trembling voice, giving Margaret such a large sum, is that safe? She has no experience. Margaret quietly stood up. Mother, don't worry. I will honor Grandpa's wishes. Stephanie made one last attempt at resistance. Sister, we're family, aren't we? You'll share some with us, right? Margaret looked at her sister. The words she had heard in the anteroom just days ago came flooding back. Unlike someone like me who showed him great grandchildren. That's about her only redeeming quality. Family? Margaret's voice was calm but had a different tone. Do you really think that, Stephanie? Stephanie couldn't answer that question. She was remembering the words she had spoken on the day of the funeral. The procedures will be completed over the next few weeks, Lawyer Harrison concluded. If you have any questions, please contact me anytime. On the way home, the family returned in separate cars. As Margaret drove alone, she thought about grandfather's final gift. It wasn't just money, it was the freedom to reclaim her own life. A week later, Margaret quietly left the family home. She didn't have many belongings. Leaving the house where she had lived for 35 years brought some sadness, but she also felt liberated. Patricia and Robert saw her off with complicated expressions, but Stephanie hadn't contacted her once since the will incident. Margaret chose a small house in a quiet residential area in the Boston suburbs. It was conveniently located 15 minutes by car from the library and had a small garden. She carefully arranged grandfather's mementos and began her new life. However, Margaret had an even bigger plan in her heart. The month after receiving the inheritance, she resigned from the library. Her colleagues were surprised, but Margaret only explained that she wanted to try new challenges. Over the following months, Margaret began working toward realizing a dream that grandfather had often talked about during his lifetime. William had loved books since his youth and often spoke of someday creating a place where people in the community could learn freely. In particular, creating a library for people burdened with family caregiving and those who lacked learning opportunities due to economic reasons had been his long-held dream. Margaret negotiated with the city's education committee and local influential people, purchasing the building of a closed elementary school. When renovation work began, she visited the site daily, paying attention to every detail to create a library that would make grandfather happy. During construction, as expected, her mother called. Margaret, is it true you're creating a library? Patricia's voice mixed surprise with slight regret. Yes, it was Grandpa's dream, Margaret replied gently. But spending such a large sum. You should make more prudent investments. Mother, this is my choice. I think Grandpa would be pleased. A few days later, Stephanie contacted her for the first time in a while. Sister, I heard about the library project. It's wonderful, her voice was more subdued than before. Actually, if there's anything we can help with. Thank you. But everything is already arranged, Margaret's reply was polite but distant. It took a year until the library opened. The building, named William Hart Memorial Library, had functions beyond a typical library. The first floor housed a regular library, while the second floor had a caregiver support center and learning support rooms. There was also a cafe corner where people exhausted from caregiving could rest. On opening day, Margaret attended the ceremony holding grandfather's photograph. The mayor and many community residents gathered. Colleagues from her librarian days also came. I am truly delighted that we can open the William Hart Memorial Library today, Margaret addressed the gathered people. This library is the place my grandfather dreamed of during his lifetime. I hope this becomes a warm place for everyone who wants to learn. During the ceremony, Margaret noticed two figures standing across the street. It was Patricia and Stephanie. Though they hadn't been invited, they watched the ceremony from afar. Margaret neither waved to them nor approached. After the ceremony ended and the last visitor had left that night, Margaret spoke to grandfather's photograph in the quiet library. Grandpa, I kept my promise. I realized your dream, she smiled. I hope many people will learn and support each other here. Especially people like us who are caring for family members, I hope this becomes a place where they can find even a little peace. The caregiver support corner of the library was lined with books Margaret herself had chosen. Not just technical caregiving books, but novels and poetry collections that provided emotional support, and most importantly, various books for spending precious alone time. A year later, the William Hart Memorial Library had become an indispensable presence in the community. Many people visited the Caregiver Support Center daily, and Margaret worked not only in facility management but also as a counselor for caregivers. One evening, while working alone in the library, an elderly woman appeared at the reception desk. Excuse me, is the director here? That's me. How can I help you? I've been caring for my mother for 3 years and I'm completely exhausted. But when I come here, my heart feels calm. Thank you so much. Margaret smiled. This was exactly the scene grandfather had hoped for. Not money or status, but supporting people as human beings. She had learned from grandfather that true family, beyond blood relations, meant relationships where people cherish each other. As the sunset streamed through the library windows, Margaret felt truly proud of her new life.